Hi, welcome back. We are now making our way into one of the largest, as we said off camera, one of the largest military operations. And what is that one, Jim?
Operation Barbarossa.
Barbarossa.
In fact, it's in the top one
Really?
of the largest military operations in history.
Oh, wow.
It is a coalition, if you will. There are Italians, there's Romanians, there's Hungarians, there's Bulgarians.
Oh, good gosh.
All the Aryans are there.
Yeah, a lot of. Which, is funny because when I was in high school, we didn't get this, in-depth detail of Operation Barbarossa.
No, in fact, I remember, my high school, we never got to World War II, ever.
Wow.
Heck, I hardly did it until I took military history in college.
Yeah.
It was just, there's so much else to talk about when you start history at 1492.
Right.
So American history, it's really hard to get all the way up. But that's a problem for a whole different podcast.
Right?
As Anthony and Jim fix the world.
Ooh, that might be fun.
It could be. It could be.
All right.
These are a problem, and this is how we solve it. I bet we get a lot more comments.
I'm sure we would. A lot more hate mail too.
Oh, I'm sure. But last time, Hitler finally cleared his flanks. He's got everything under control. The continent is his, really.
In a way, yeah.
I mean, Spain and Portugal really don't count.
Well,
Denmark and Norway, so that takes care of that.
Yeah.
Sweden is always neutral, and it's really hard to get to and not really worth fighting over. Besides, Sweden already shipping him iron ore and coal.
There you go.
So, that works out well.
He's either wined and dined or slashed and burned almost every part of the continent.
Yeah, the only one that would be left in that little clip is Finland.
Yeah, well.
Who is now German ally.
Right.
Because, if you'll remember, we talked briefly about it right after the conquest of Poland.
Right.
Russia decided it would be a great time to invade Finland.
Well,
and they got their
smacked.
butts kicked.
Yes.
Until they threatened to firebomb Helsinki, and then they won.
Right.
They got that little chunk north of Leningrad, way up there.
Yes.
But now Finland joins the Axis powers. It's the only Axis power that I know of that nobody in the West really blames for being on Hitler's side, because they were really just anti-Russian, specifically anti-Soviet, but Russian too.
Right.
They're Finns.
Yeah. Well, they've been kind of either occupied or destroyed by the Russians for many, many years.
Yeah. But this is their first real opportunity of being free.
Right.
They were either part of Sweden or they were part of Russia for most of their history.
Sure.
So this is another one of those new nations, so to speak.
Well.
And they're very different. Their language is different than almost any other in Europe. I think the closest one is Hungarian, and it's not that close. So it makes it a kind of a weird outlier for Scandinavia even, because all the rest of the countries, you drive across the border and the signs look very similar.
Right.
The spelling doesn't change a whole lot.
The Finnish are a little iffy.
Yeah, they're just a different group of people, which is fine. But the Russians picked on them, and so now they're mad. They joined. So we have this three-pronged invasion. Hitler manages to get basically 90% of his army within 10 miles of the Russian border, and nobody knows.
How could he do such a thing? Honestly, I mean, you've got a large division of tanks and
just
artillery and
people. Several million men and vehicles and horses and everything.
I mean, seriously, how could somebody do such a thing? Well, then again, you are using a lot of your allies' land.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is you own or are directly allied with everybody that touches Soviet Union.
That does make a better opportunity, but again...
But still, you would think Stalin would have had enough spies to detect that kind of movement, but he didn't. And as we get farther into the war and we hear about people like the agent Rose something or other, that's just the code name, that was in Berlin, that was feeding them information later in the war, you're like, where was this guy? Maybe he was actually deployed and couldn't communicate or something. I don't know.
You never know. You don't know. But at the same time, it's so odd to think you have millions of men going to the border and nothing.
Yes.
But hey.
And Stalin is convinced that the non-aggression pact will hold. until he breaks it. Which
of course.
I think according to the documents that they released from, like the KGB in the 1990s, 1943, he would have been rolling west.
I'm sure
That
he
was the
would've.
plan. He was building his Stalin line in Western Russia to keep the Germans out in case they invaded. But the non-aggression pact and the fact that they bit off that huge chunk of Poland,
That does help.
it just became less important because you had like 150 miles of extra territory. This front line is now behind the lines.
What you would assume, one would assume after all of the treaties and the fact that you have taken over half of stomping ground, if you will, that Hitler's not dumb enough to do such a thing.
Well, no. And unfortunately for Stalin and for a lot of Russians, his thought that he's always the smartest person in the room. Now, of course, the fact that he has terrified his nation into basically believing that,
Right.
to the point where they once gave him a standing ovation for like 4 hours,
Right.
until basically somebody died of a heart attack,
Of course.
and that stopped the ovation.
Yeah.
Like, so somebody had to die to get the
Yeah.
applause to stop. What kind of narcissism does that entail? We talk about Hitler being a narcissist and being very, I'm the guy.
Yes.
Stalin is no different.
Well, and again, Stalin is, of course, living a life of, grandeur in a way. He is.
Oh, yeah, he's never going to run on anything.
No, he's the guy who, again, comes from very poor means and becoming a dictator of one of the largest nations in the world doesn't help
No.
your ego.
Oh, no. And his absolute ruthlessness at anybody who would challenge him.
You are dead.
Yeah, you're welcome to Siberia or welcome to a cell in Lubyanka prison where suddenly you get to see the drain
Mm-hmm.
and then not anything else.
Right.
But Stalin is just absolutely convinced that this is going to work. This was the best idea ever. And I'm sure he thinks it was his.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just a non-aggression pact, they have this whole let's tear apart Poland pact. So they're really not even just a we want peace. It was we're friends.
Yeah.
We're going to tear apart a whole country
Okay.
together. And the Germans are going to let us take over those Baltic states. Notice on this map there are no Baltic states.
Right. Yeah,
That's-
Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're gone.
They're gone because he took them after, And these were countries that are somewhat Germanic,
Mm-hmm.
mostly formed from the Hanseatic League back way back.
Wow, yeah.
14 and 1500s. They were settlers that landed on those coasts and set up ports to trade. Lithuanians especially, fairly close ties to Germans.
Well,
They
they're
speak German, but they're gone.
They're not far from East Prussia, so.
Right next door. Probably all occupied by the Teutonic Knights at one point.
Oh,
so
sure.
we can go quite a ways back in history and see how they tended to be more Western
Right.
in their thinking and their
Of course.
understanding than most Russians. But
Mm-hmm.
so Hitler gets this monstrosity of an army, and when he launches in the morning of 22nd of June, the Soviets have no idea what hits them. The Luftwaffe is having a heyday.
I'm sure.
They
are.
destroy, I don't even remember how many aircraft. Basically half the Soviet Air Force is gone in a week.
Oh my gosh.
And almost all of it on the ground. And the biggest problem all runs through one problem: Joseph Stalin. He literally goes into a fugue state for almost 2 weeks after the invasion. A depression, really. He just refuses to give orders. The armies can't move without his orders because he's got that kind of control.
Right.
And the army is literally sitting in place. They can't retreat because, oh gosh, no, the NKVD will be there to take you out and shoot you.
Right.
Because they don't care about tactics, strategy, they care about obedience.
Right.
And Stalin didn't say you could run away, so don't.
Yeah.
Which causes these Kesselschlacht, these pincer movements. The German army would drive just like they did in France, except with two instead of one to the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
They would take these two and they would put these in here in this area, the cauldron as they would call it, and then the infantry armies would come and reduce them.
Oh.
And eventually, in certain spots, 600,000 guys at a time, 300,000
Lord.
here. The Soviet Union in the first couple months of the war lose almost 2 million men. In fact, the Germans are utterly confused as the war goes on because according to their intelligence, they've destroyed more divisions than the Soviet army had. And the problem is, of course, he's creating, once he breaks free of his fugue state, and things start to happen, we start seeing this move to the east. He literally is picking up whole factories and moving them east of the Ural Mountains, denying Hitler the industry of the Donetsk Basin down here. See, it's even labeled for you. This part of the Ukraine is very industrialized. By the way, this part's still in the news.
Right, yes, exactly, exactly.
And in the north, you know, there's the push towards Leningrad. It's not super quick, doesn't have a lot of armor. The most of the armor is concentrated in that center, Army Group Center, where you have like Manstein and all these big guys that show up. And they are literally just going to town. This is their dream, an open plain against infantry armies. Terrifyingly enough, down here in Army Group South, our man Gerd von Rundstedt is back. There he is.
Yeah, there you go.
They fight a battle just to the west of Uman there. And Germans notice that these tanks these Russians are using, they're pretty sweet.
I'm sure they
Hard
are.
to kill. They're called T-34s. Now, Soviet Army doesn't have a lot of them yet. These are brand new. And so they're using older models, which are slow. Russian tanks tend to be slow, heavily armored, but have really wide treads so they can go, because they don't have a lot of roads, real roads. I mean, most German tanks are designed to run on highways.
Right.
You know, they're ready for cobblestone or cement.
Right.
So they have a harder time cross country. Soviet tanks have these wide treads so they can go through mud and swampy areas that German tanks
not sink
and
at
not
all.
sink because it lowers your pounds per square inch because you have more square inches.
Right.
And this tank is really good. And the Germans, of course, are in Panzer IIIs and IVs, which are good tanks, but comparatively, they don't even show up.
So what's the main goal then? What is the
Topple Stalin.
Okay.
I mean, really, when it comes down to it, obviously they're going to take land, but really the key factor in this whole invasion is regime change. Get rid of Stalin. So we need to drive to Moscow, which is an incredibly long way.
So you're looking at over 150 or so miles just to the Russian border, right?
Let's see, that's 250, that's like 750 miles to Moscow.
Okay. Okay, wow. 750 miles to Moscow.
This is the longest potential drive by an army that's ever been attempted even.
Now again, you have your tanks. You've
Right.
got your infantry who are marching on foot.
Yes.
And you've got
Your supplies,
your
which
supplies
are
who
mostly coming by horse.
oh my goodness.
This is not the mechanized juggernaut that we won't see until 1944.
Well, I was going to say, yeah,
In
'cause
France.
you're still in 1941, where Hitler's still trying to kind of piece together things.
In a lot of ways, the German army is like the frontline stuff is now the futuristic Buck Rogers stuff.
Right.
But everything else to support and supply an army is still 1918.
Oh my goodness.
It hasn't really improved. So you see these operational pauses, if you know, to use a fancy term, but the armor can only go so far. They burn out, they rip up their treads, they burn out transmissions. We talked about that with France.
Yes, of course.
And this happens 2 or 3 times. But the thing is these generals get a little bit ahead of themselves. They start trying to be the one that gets to Moscow first. But, you know, they get giddy. For lack of a better term. Well, this is going so well. The number of units destroyed, the number of prisoners taken, the aircraft and tanks destroyed, the numbers are just insane.
Now,
The Germans are looking, we've destroyed more armor than we have.
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Stalin's own son taken during this operation as well?
Yes. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
taken. One of them. There's two of them.
Right. One of them, yes.
Yeah.
Sergey, I believe.
I think
can't
so.
remember what is. They've got. So
He has
many,
3 kids that I
right.
know of, 2 sons and a daughter.
Right.
And they're all alcoholics, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure.
If you had that as your dad, I'm
Uh-huh.
thinking I'd drink a lot.
For
Stay
sure.
in. I'd drink a lot and stay in. That's what
Right.
I do. But, Kiev falls fairly quickly. Minsk, which is, halfway there, basically.
My goodness.
And these pincer movements keep just biting off chunks of the Soviet army and then devouring it with, it's like they just slice into the body of Russia and take off a chunk, and then the infantry comes up and eats it.
Yeah.
I mean,
almost like a bug.
One of the biggest supply problems, besides the fact that you're doing everything by horse,
Yeah.
is that in Western Europe it was fine because trains ran on the exact same gauge. In other words,
Sure.
how wide apart the tracks are.
Right.
Russia uses a completely different gauge, much
My
wider.
goodness, of course.
Which means, so for the logistics people, the engineers, those German guys that are always have their shirts off, their tunics off because they're hot. You see every picture you see them, none of them are wearing tunics because they're busy.
Right.
They're digging stuff.
Yeah.
But that means they have to literally change out the rails
Oh my gosh.
as you go
Wow.
to help supply the army. Because obviously, if you're going to do it by horse, you need to be fairly close to the front.
Of course.
So you need to get that railhead up to the front lines, and that's very difficult. But this push, remember, they start 6 weeks later than they planned. Because they were
That's
Betsy
true. They were
Barth
dealing with
Monk.
the issue in
the
Greece
Balkans.
and all throughout there. Yes.
So they, that's kind of one of those what ifs. What if Yugoslavia wouldn't have backed out and Hitler would have invaded in May? Well, if you look at the almanac for 1941, it might have saved 2 weeks because it rained like crazy that May.
Oh.
It was.
Wow.
It would have been. Everything would have been so muddy they would have gotten nowhere.
Right.
In fact, it would have been a waste of an invasion because they would have basically driven about 10 miles and gotten stuck.
I couldn't imagine.
So but what if they would have invaded on June 7th instead of June 22nd? That starts becoming one of those. Oh my gosh, what could happen? What would because this push, this massacre of the Soviet Army and Air Force. The Air Force is almost gone by the end of 1941. It'll come back as things like Spitfires, Typhoons, and P-40 Warhawks, and things start coming from Lend-Lease.
Right.
By September, the British are already supplying the Murmansk, that spot way up north in the Arctic Circle.
Right.
That goes up around Scandinavia.
Right.
And so, despite Winston Churchill's absolute and utter loathing of communism and everything it is, he realizes the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes.
At least for this war, we're going to be allies, whether we like it or not.
But the thing that I don't understand again is why. What would Hitler accomplish?
What would he accomplish? Well, I don't think he was real worried about like the Guinness Book of Military Records. I conquered more than anybody else ever. I don't think.
Yeah.
That probably was in the back of his mind, not the Guinness part. But
Sure. I'm going to conquer more than Alexander
I am a
the
conqueror.
Great.
I deserve it.
Yes.
We are going to build Lebensraum, which is, to me, one of the funniest parts about that is Germany in 1933, when he takes over, is a very urban, very industrialized nation.
Right.
His image of Germans is a bunch of farmers with peasants living like knights of the 1500s, where they have their manors scattered throughout Poland and Russia because they've conquered these subhumans and they're going to make them work for them.
Really?
He has this agricultural dream of what that would look like. And it's kind of weird to me that but then again, he is not known for his logical consistency.
No, of course not.
Because, there's no Aryans. They went to India, by the way.
Right. The question that I do have, though, again, is how far would he have to? He would have to go way out east. He'd have to go past the Urals to try and destroy any major sense of this regime.
Well, when we look at Kiev, would have been a major key because it was the capital of the Ukraine.
Of course.
Kyiv for the Ukrainian people.
Right.
Minsk, of course, is Belarus.
Right.
But Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg,
Mhm.
former capital, so an important political spot.
Sure.
Down here, you really don't got anything past Kiev. You got some Rostov-on-Don and a couple other places that are
Mhm.
important,
Mhm.
but they're not major cities like you see Moscow.
Right.
The question is if, I guess to make a long story short, the battle goes well, obviously. October, there's some rain, slows everything back down, which is probably good for the Germans because their supply line gets a chance to catch up.
Yeah, you kind of get the cart before the horse, literally.
Yeah, well, the cart can see the horse finally.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, there's a dotted line. I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but it runs almost to Rostov, almost to Moscow, and around Leningrad. They have literally put in jeopardy every major target they had. The question would be if, say, they got that extra 2 weeks, because in December, there are units of the German army who get close enough to see the domes of the Kremlin.
Oh my.
They are close. Stalin is emptying the city of office workers. They're digging ditches outside of Moscow to protect it.
Wow.
He has not left. The question is, if Moscow falls, better yet, if Stalin falls, does the Soviet Union stay in the fight? Hitler is gambling no.
That's a big gamble, though.
It's a huge, I mean, you have to drive 750 miles to even test it.
Yes, exactly. And again, you're looking at a very egotistical individual.
Yes, you are. Who believes he's on a divine mission.
You're right.
To raise the German people to their proper place.
Right.
They are the Herrenvolk, the master race.
But again, it does not make sense.
Well,
Why?
not to us, because we don't understand the concept of why would you want to conquer all that? And of course, why would you want to conquer all these people you don't like anyway?
Exactly.
And that's the key. Again, when he drives into the Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
he is met, or he's not because he didn't drive in.
Right.
But when his troops drive into the Ukraine, it looks a lot like when Americans go into Belgium. People are giving them candy and throwing flowers, and the pretty girls are dressed up and got their pigtails.
Sure.
And they're all blonde-haired and blue-eyed. So, the German guys are like,
Yes, this is heaven.
This is heaven. And the army rolls through and goes and fights.
Sure.
In a place that, some of the descriptions of fighting in the Ukraine, which is it's Kansas with bigger.
Right.
Because it's in Russia, so it's bigger.
Yes, of course. Of course.
But I mean, it's like being in the open ocean. They get lost sometimes.
I'm sure they
because
do.
there's just nothing but grain and open terrain. And of course, to the Germans, this place is crazy wild. Even at this point, Germany, there's not a lot of wildlife. There's not a lot of wild territory. Even the Black Forest is pretty well groomed.
They've got gummy bears
Yes.
instead of real bears.
Right, because I mean, it's been settled for so long and so heavily.
Right.
But behind the front line come these guys with the little skull and crossbones on their collars.
Oh,
And they start taking first the Jews, and then of course anybody who was a communist that they knew of, like a mayor.
Yes.
Because of course you couldn't be a mayor unless you were a communist.
Right.
Kind of like the same thing we'll see at the end of the war. You couldn't be a mayor unless you were a Nazi. So how do we kill all the Nazis? We'll have to kill 20% of the population.
Right.
And within a year, the Ukraine, who's worshiping these German troops, liberating them from Stalin. Because remember, 10 years ago they were starving to death.
Yes.
Because Stalin created an artificial famine.
Right.
Within a year, they're shooting at Germans. They're cutting supply lines in the back.
Oh
they are now
my.
partisans.
Wow.
Exactly. Within a year, because the Gestapo and
The Einsatzgruppen.
the Einsatzgruppen, the SS in general.
Right.
Not so much the Waffen-SS, although they don't have a pretty record either.
I'm sure not.
But I mean, this desire to eliminate the undesirables, the Jews, the communists,
The Roma,
the
anyone
Roma,
along those lines.
anybody like that is a target, and they just can't wait. Himmler and his gang, because of course Himmler doesn't have a stake in this. Goering's got the Luftwaffe going,
Mhm.
and the army's going. And where's Himmler?
Well,
Hitler's
he's-
got to establish himself in this weirdly, we see Germany in movies and kind of in our minds as this hyper-efficient, vigilant police state. It was a ramshackle mess of almost feudal aristocracy, where, you know, the Waffen-SS come in existence. They don't need to come into existence. Their entire job originally was to guard Hitler's body, literally bodyguards.
Yeah.
But then, of course, Leibstandarte-Führer is a division of Panzer Grenadiers, mostly getting their stuff from Czechoslovakia, surprisingly enough. Because the army, of course, has first dibs on tanks and stuff, so they have to go to other factories where they have slave labor camps who are run by the SS.
Right.
So a lot of their equipment is not necessarily German originally, it's Czech.
There you go. Wow.
But anyway, there's this weird competition always going on. Later in the war, we're going to see a Panzer division. It's the Hermann Goering Panzer Division. It's literally an Air Force unit with tanks, because they have to compete over and over in different areas, trying to establish themselves as Hitler's favorite. Because, well, they're not dumb. No man is immortal.
No. They understand that quite frequently.
They understand the concept of the slave in the chariot saying, "Caesar, thou art mortal."
Right, right.
And so they need to be number two. And
Yeesh.
There's this
compete
weird
with those
behind-the-scenes competition,
Sure.
which allow an admiral named Canaris, which I always thought was Canaries, but who is not very Nazi. In fact, not at all a Nazi. But he runs the intelligence, Army intelligence, the Obfair, or Abteilung or something. I can't remember. It's Ob somebody.
Oh, okay.
Which is just basically office.
Yes.
But anyway, he ends up being, foreshadowing, he ends up being the guy who actually signs the surrender documents.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
But he is where a lot of anti-Nazis go to hide. Because you got to remember, a lot of these guys are patriots.
Sure.
They believe in Germany. They don't necessarily believe we should be in war with Russia, but the nation has called.
It's time to answer that.
Right. You don't turn that, when the nation calls, to turn it down, you would be a coward. And we think that's weird, but when we look at the United States in 1942, men committed suicide in great numbers if they were considered 4F.
Meaning they were not
They
fit for
weren't
duty.
right. They couldn't be drafted, or they wouldn't be taken because they had flat feet, or hemorrhoids, or bad eyesight, or asthma.
Wow.
They couldn't go, and they would have a job, maybe even an important job, like running the power plant for the city.
Yeah.
They would have a very important job, but that shame that they couldn't go as well caused a lot of suicides. It's not something that shows up in a lot of the history books, because it's not a proud moment for America.
Yeah, it's not a pretty sight for American military.
No, it's, just the way our country, and women would ask men, why aren't you in uniform?
And you don't want to say, oh, well, I have flat feet, or
Right.
oh, I have asthma, but...
Well, you definitely don't want to say I have hemorrhoids.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's one you probably leave
We'll
off.
skip that one.
Yeah.
I had an uncle who worked specifically at a power plant around Philadelphia, and he got draft notice.
Yeah.
I don't know, 3 or 4 times during the war, and he would go in and tell his boss that I've been notified that I have to report to the draft board, and his boss would take it and make a phone call, and suddenly he didn't have to go. Because he was considered critical. He was an engineer for the power plant.
Well, that is definitely a critical position.
It sounds great to send him off, but he's got way too many skills to be wasted pulling a trigger. In fact, he's keeping Philadelphia, at that time, probably one of the top 5 or 6 cities, population-wise and industrial-wise, in the United States.
Right.
With power.
Yeah, well,
that's more important than any number of divisions.
Well, that is very, very true, very true.
But he had the same issue, people asking why he's not in uniform. And so when we think about Germans going to war, is there really a choice? Well, there is.
Yeah.
Concentration camp
or
Eastern Front.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure you can tell the difference, but one shows pride and a sense of community, and you'll get support.
Right.
The other side does not.
And the other side actually,
you might you might be morally right, but you're all alone.
Right.
So,
Well,
wow, that's Barbarossa. yeah, this is the numbers in that first 6 months between June and December. Because June and December, so December, they're almost there. They've surrounded Leningrad. They're over here. They're not, Stalingrad's a little further over.
Right.
But it's not really that important of a city until 1942.
Right.
It's a small industrial town on the Volga River. But Moscow, they're in sight of Moscow. In fact, there are reports that some scouts were actually on the east side of Moscow. But of course, they're just scouts. They're not going to stay. They can't hold territory.
Right, yes.
But suddenly, out of the winter snow that's already starting falling. Now, when the snow first started falling, this was great because it hardened the mud. And the tanks got back in action.
But unfortunately...
But then the temperature started falling to things like -40.
Yeah, that's a little cold.
Literally freezing their crankcases so that when they tried to start their engine, they'd put it in gear and literally shatter their transmissions.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, and if you were totally exposed, it could literally freeze you while you took a poop and kill you.
Oh my goodness.
That's how cold it
wow. That is some cold
That
weather.
is some cold. That is not cold I've ever wanted to experience. But we forget that, I mean, Moscow is, what, 51 degrees north latitude?
True.
It's, well past Minneapolis for us. Mm-hmm. And so it's cold.
Right.
And that air comes directly off the Arctic Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gets super cold all through, well, all the way down to the Black Sea, it gets super cold.
True.
And that's their vacation spot.
Right, Crimea.
Yeah, the Crimea is like the place to go, but suddenly Hitler's army is overextended, and a bunch of divisions of Siberian troops who are really equipped for cold weather
of course
arrive. Why did they arrive? Because the Japanese have kept their word to Stalin that they won't enter the war because of the non-aggression pact.
Wow.
In fact, they've got other plans starting in, I think it's October of 41 themselves.
Yes, they do.
Which we'll talk about next time.
Right.
But these fresh, I don't know how well trained, but well equipped for winter fighting troops show up outside of Moscow and push the Germans back. And that whole first winter, Hitler demands that they do not step back, retreat one step. And that's a whole argument. But I've seen the counter argument that if he doesn't say that, where does the army stop? It's a long way back before there are really good geographical boundaries.
Right.
They would have had to probably give up 100 to 150 miles to really establish a solid line.
Wow.
That's too much. Hitler's not going to allow that, and most generals wouldn't want to allow that either.
No, you're literally giving up.
So instead of the army cracking and possibly breaking, because it gets bad fast because they don't have any winter gear.
Of course not.
Because this was all supposed to be over.
Right.
I'm like, did you not plan on being there at Christmas?
I guess not.
I guess not. But like you said, this is a mind-boggling invasion of such scope. It's so huge. It's really out of our scope of understanding.
Of course. Because we never see something like this again.
No. Well, really, the next thing we see is what is it, Operation Saturn or Uranus, which is the push across the River Elbe with the Soviets going the other way.
Right.
And that's huge as well, but still smaller scale than a 1,500 mile long battlefront.
Yes.
That gets wider at certain points. And,
right.
It gets big when you start looking from here all the way up. We're talking 2,000 miles.
That's unreal.
How do you guard that? Now, some of it you don't need to guard because it's just unusable terrain, especially up north. But it's still a lot.
It's a lot of area that you need to cover with a lot of troops.
How are you going to occupy that? Now, of course, if you win, say if it works, if you take Moscow and you kill Stalin, and assume the Soviet Union does fall apart, which I think you could probably make a pretty good case because it was in pretty big wreck when Stalin died.
True.
Of natural causes.
Right.
Under the pressures of a German assault, I think you would have had generals probably surrendering
in waves.
And then, of course, that would make another general's position unworkable. So they'd either have to retreat farther into the east. And once you go so far in the east, though, what are you going to do? You don't got the industry or the supplies.
Well, you're literally...
The German army would literally just be chasing you. There wouldn't be fighting. It would just be a chase.
Right.
And I think the gamble was a poor one because you're literally carrying. You have to roll boxcars to win.
Yes, exactly.
But they came within, 20 miles.
Yeah. Which is utterly surprising
Especially
to me,
with
but
the vehicles at the time.
I know.
It's not until 2003 that we see a longer, continuous advance of armored forces. That's the invasion of Iraq.
Oh my.
Over 400 miles without stopping, basically.
Wow. That's a long time.
That's a long drive, and
Mm-hmm.
if you watch the videos and the documentaries that were embedded with that initial invasion, everybody was sleepy.
I'm sure.
Everybody
I'm
was
sure.
sleepy by the time they got to Baghdad and started doing the thunder rubs. But it took 70 years, well, almost 70 years, 60 years, before anybody even attempted something like this.
Well, I think they realized, hey, this is a lot of resources. This is a lot of manpower.
Oh, well, yeah. Of course, then they proceed to start killing off that manpower.
Yes.
Which is, again, one of those what ifs. But that what if is based on the concept that Hitler wasn't Hitler.
True.
This is a part of his entire political ideology, that these are subhumans that we deserve to be conquerors over. And so there's no reason to treat them like humans or potential allies.
Right.
Can you imagine 15 suddenly Ukrainian divisions who can't wait to go to Moscow?
Oh, they would be.
They can't
They
wait.
would be on.
Oh,
They would be on hog heaven.
Oh yeah, they'd be like, just give me a rifle and a couple bullets. I'm
I'm done.
I'm out.
I'm good.
Let's
See
go.
you later.
We'll
Hell,
see.
I'll walk down there.
Yeah, I'll walk the whole way, because of course their desire for revenge would have been huge.
Oh, for sure.
But
that doesn't happen.
there was no
unfortunately.
way the Nazis could have seen that as a usable concept.
Sure.
Which made them fools.
Right.
So Operation Barbarossa, largest military operation in history, and the casualties, of course, prove it out. I mean, when you look at the whole war, it's what, 20 million Russians probably.
That's unreal.
At least 10. At least for sure 10 million Russians.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even count the ones they just gassed. We're
Right.
just talking about killed in battle or, during the fighting. And the German army, for the most part, on the way in, was somewhat disciplined, but it broke down fairly quickly, especially with the exuberance of victory. When you've driven
course.
500 or 600 miles, you think you won.
Right.
I mean, nobody
But-
can be that big, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we start seeing a lot of the signs of an army losing its morale, losing its discipline. You see rapes, looting, and a lot of things that aren't battle focused. And they start thinking about them. And when an army loses that cohesion, nothing good happens very well.
Of course not.
Which is, again, that argument why maybe Hitler's stand fast order was the only thing that saved them. Was they had to stand together because there wasn't an option to stand apart and do their own thing.
No thanks.
Yeah, no thanks. I would have no desire to be any part on either side of,
No.
of the Eastern Front or
No
the
way.
Western Front. for
No
sure.
way. But anyway, I think that is a good stopping point
Yes.
for us. Operation Barbarossa. Wow, what a terrible time for both the Russians and the Germans.
But it's a great time for the Germans this year.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, right.
Next year, maybe not.
So do again, make sure you tune in for next time. Hit that subscribe button, share, and like us on all social media platforms if you could.
Yeah.
All right.
That's it.